we are working party 1, approaches to the assessment of risks before the pediatric trial. So we were a group of about, let's say, 12 to 15 people and had members from various backgrounds. First, we would like to review non-clinical data. In particular, are juvenile toxicity data available, and also with regard to reproductive toxicity. Is there chronic versus acute use of the drug planned? And that has, of course, some consequences for the kind of toxicity data we would like to see. In oncology, we would like to see if there are cell lines from pediatric cancers available and whether they have been tested with regard to, let's say, responsiveness to the drug that is planned to be used. And also, we would like to have information if there are any animal marker data which are responsive. So these are the non-clinical data. With regard to perhaps preliminary PK/PD data, there's the experience that the Cmax is typically higher in children. So we would like to ask, is the dose adjusted, in particular with regard to the, let's say, the age of the patient, the child, as, for example, the liver is in a very neonates and very young children has a different capacity to adults, and also weight is a very important a variable in finding out which is a appropriate dosage. Then we would like to see data about the assay development. That means, can the drug and metabolites detected in very small volumes only? And is a pharmaceutical formulation, are these liquids, tablets, and so appropriate for that particular age group? For example, kids be younger than 6 years of age have typically problems with swallowing tablets. Third, the PIP. Typically, the pediatric investigation plan is not available, only a summary, but this was considered by some as to be not helpful, and occasionally also the PIP is quite old and not anymore the state of the art. What we would like to see with regard to the PIP is a kind of executive summary with reasons and providing the rationale why there are certain specifications. Then, if there should be always an IB, and we need a reassurance needed that it's state of the art at the moment when it's submitted. Fifth, for drugs already approved for adults, we would like to see, of course, a summary of product characteristics. But this is in the future. As far as I know, the DSUR is only with the pharmacovigilance legislation, which is coming into force in mid of 2012. We would like to have access to the most recent DSUR and safety data from all other relevant sources. So not only those information that are provided in the SPC. A further important topic with regard to the trial, to the assessment of risk before the pediatric trial actually is conducted, is a planned trial conduct as described in the trial protocol. Here are criteria: the invasiveness of the trial. Is there a lot of blood sampling or even more invasive procedures? For example, MRI has been mentioned yesterday, which typically needs in young children, anesthesia, things like that. Second, is there a placebo control, in particular in the case that there is a standard treatment available, the number of visits and the amount of blood needed? That was also raised that there may be confidentiality issues, in particular if photos or videos are made and if the trial data are transferred outside of the European Union. And this is not, it's my last point for this subtitle, but not the least important, is the trial relevant and truly needed for children? This is, of course, a very important point. We were also asked to provide suggestions. With regard to the PIP, we think that we need a kind of executive summary which provides a major content and providing reasons why that was for the decisions somehow provided in the PIP. With regard what can ECs or how can ethics committees help EMA and the PETCO, one could think about that the ethics committees who do the single opinion, if they reject a trial application, that they inform in one way or the other EMA or the PETCO and providing the reasons. There was a discussion about confidentiality of the information, but I think it should be no problem to provide the OIDRAC number to the PETCO and say, we have rejected. If you are interested in the reasons, ask the submittant. And with regard to the children involvement, we had a very interesting discussion. One proposal was that to find out about the distress and the risks inflicted in the or accompanied with the study, you can visit the study centers and see how it's actually done, how is the trial and the child care actually done. And also we propose to have focus groups with children who have already participated in a study to find out and to identify the sources of distress and risks as they are perceived by children. Thank you very much and to my group, and if anybody wants to contribute or to complement what I've reported or to correct it, if I have something misunderstood, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your report. We're going to take the 4 in a row because we'll begin to see some areas probably of overlap and then have open discussion following the 4 reports. So anyone who wants to comment, please keep your comments. They will be received. We're now turning to the neonates with Dr. Bax. No. All right, we'll go then to, we'll go to Ronald Dercote on addressing vulnerability of children.
Thank you. This is the report of subgroup 3, and we'll do it shortly. We address vulnerability of children in details of trial design, and as examples, monitoring, risk, stopping rules. So in terms of the 3 questions, the first question was how in PIPs can EMA, PDCO help the ECs? And one of the suggestions which came up is similar to what was reported by Group 1. We also thought that a summary of the PIPs would be very helpful in view of the huge number of papers which have to be covered. And so an executive summary might be very helpful there. A second issue which we discussed and which I think is of interest is that there is a lot of experience assembled here at this meeting from pediatric ethical committees and also of some committees which are responsible at the country level for trial evaluation. If you look to the results of the questionnaire where 90 out of, I think, maybe 1,000 METCs responded, you can say, well, it's disappointing that up to 900 don't respond. You can also say it's a positive signal that 90 METCs responded. And this offers the opportunity maybe to set up a kind of a group of METCs from different countries which can share their experiences One of the problems which we have in Europe is that protocols which are agreed by some ABTCs in some countries are refused in other countries, and we're not sure at all where we differ in the criteria on basis of which we agree or disagree. And it might be very helpful to get such a group together and then maybe use existing data which are in the possession of industry in order to see what the differences are and whether or not we're able to harmonize. A third issue which was raised was that there is already a lot of work done in existing networks in Europe, and one of the initiatives which has been taken is the EMPREMA, the network of networks, which has a very nice website and which contains contributions of many subspecialty groups in Europe, and also guidelines for quality guidelines to do research. So it's good to also use that and stimulate that further in Europe. We discussed also the involvement of children. And agreed that that is an important issue. On the one side, there's obviously our professional input as a pediatrician, which we use to say, for example, reduce blood volume, move into the direction of non-invasive techniques, etc. On the other side, there is the involvement in many countries of medical ethical persons in METCs who independently look also to the interest of children. And then last but not least, I think in many situations in Europe, also parent involvement, at least involvement of an independent person in METC seems to be very useful as a way to protect the interest of children. Last, one of the issues which might be very helpful for the METCs is that at some stage a checklist will be produced which contains all the items necessary to execute trials. But this can also be done as part of the initiative to bring medical ethical committees together from different countries and then move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Christophe Maal on different approaches then for assessing the relationship of benefits and risks.
Thank you. So the task of our group was to look at different approaches to assessing particularly the relationship between benefit and risks. And our group was interesting with regards to the representation of different stakeholders, in that particularly ethics committees were actually underrepresented, and we had a high representation of industry, which obviously brought another important aspect. And one of the initial points of discussion was that we actually have more stakeholders in this process that is addressed in these work group discussions. It's not just the ethics committees and PDCO, but we identified at least 6 stakeholder groups: patients, investigators, sponsors, the regulatory authorities, but also the national competent authorities and the ethics committees. So probably we need to always consider those stakeholders as well. We also had input in our group, thankfully, from FDA representatives as well as from Health Canada, which really enriched the discussion. Now, regarding the differences in approaches, the basic feeling of the group was that ethics committees and PDCO differed, at least in there was a tendency to differ, that ethics committees put more weight on assessing the individual risk and benefit. And individual trials, whereas the PDCO was looking more at the general need and benefit and the overall development program. So there is some discrepancy in the general approach, and obviously practical issues involved that the PDCO, with regards to the timing of assessment, PDCO looking at development plans quite early, and maybe it's in a situation where there's much less detail available, particularly on a specific protocol, whereas the ethics committees would have to consider all the details of the programs. But I also had an impression, the feeling in the discussion that when we looked at the balance of benefit versus risk, that the ethics committees were more concerned about the risks, and maybe because not looking at the whole development program and the needs behind it, maybe have put more weight on the risk than on the benefit that the program would bring. When the ethics committee voiced that in the interpretation of in the assessment of benefit versus risk, they felt to be restricted by the law, and this apparently is maybe just the interpretation of the law in some countries more than in others, with regards to assessing the individual benefit and versus group benefit, with some countries, ethics committees from some countries stating that they wouldn't see any chance within the limits of the law to allow certain comparisons in certain risk groups. And clearly, what was voiced is that there's a lack of harmonization maybe in the interpretation of the law, and that guidance to harmonize opinions across countries would be very, very valuable. And we had input from Health Canada, where recently a document was issued by Health Canada to try to harmonize the views and the interpretation of law by different committees. Obviously, we had a lot of input from industry, and one important message from industry was that they would have to live in this field of, let's say, different approaches, and that industry usually tries to take a middle ground to live with regulators' opinions as well as ethics committee opinions eventually, and this can sometimes be difficult. Regarding the point of how can the interaction be improved, the communication, and it's two questions, but how can PDCO help ethics committees and the other way around? But I think it comes down to a dialogue in both directions. And the key words with regards to improving this process that were discussed were giving more rationales about why decisions are taken for a development program, but also for a specific protocol regarding the choice of the population, inclusion and exclusion criteria, regarding comparators. So if there has been a discussion at the PDCO that went back and forward and involved experts, that ethics committees should really know the reasons why eventually certain decisions were taken. So this need for giving the rationales and being transparent about that led to the discussions how this information could be conveyed, and there was discussion about the summary report, whether this would be helpful for ethics committees to review. Practically, there was agreement that maybe these lengthy documents that are difficult to understand in the way they are being developed, maybe too much for ethics committee members to review, and there's a need for executive summaries, and who should be responsible to condense this information. It was felt that this was more up to the sponsors to convey the key messages to ethics committees. There was the suggestion to maybe restructure summary reports in a way that is more consistent with the way scientific advice assesses benefit versus risks. And then there was a suggestion that EMA and PDCO should work on communicating not just information on specific programs, but also on general issues with regards to methodology and standard PIPs. because this is a two-way communication, ethical advice could be incorporated earlier in the protocol development, both by the sponsors but also PDCO. This will probably help, was felt by the group, that to harmonize this process to some extent, but it will probably not completely resolve the heterogeneity in opinions, first because of cultural differences, but also because the assessment of benefit versus risk is not something, is not a hard science, but it's really a soft science. We had one clinician in our group who clearly stated that clinicians should be more involved in protocol development with regards to the science and the need, as well as the ethics, benefit versus risks, and the feasibility. This clinician felt that frequently clinicians, clinical researchers are at the end of the chain. They are just confronted with protocols that have been signed off by regulatory groups as well as ethics committees, and they wouldn't have a chance to have a say. I think the discussion said that obviously clinicians should be involved early on, and this is happening, but maybe does not involve all the clinicians that eventually running the research, particularly since clinician, and this leads me to the next point, involvement of children and parent clinicians very often are the proxy for patients and parents' opinion about the research, because it's more difficult to ask patients. We discussed that at the PDCO level there is a process ongoing to involve children more in the discussions, and we discussed how far this work would happen in ethics committees. There are patient representatives, but not necessarily representing pediatrics, and that depending on the therapeutic area, it may be difficult to find patient organizations that really represent a common view of what would be what benefits could be balanced against the risks of specific research. Thank you. I think this is essentially what we discussed.
Thank you. We have one more report to go before we open for discussion. And I think we're going to have it on screen. So this is Dr.
Okay.
Ralph Baxton on trials with neonates.
Okay, at last we managed. Hearing all the other reports, of course, many discussions have been also reflected in our group as neonates, as an age group. So closer. Okay, sorry. We had a wide-ranging discussion which started mainly with methodological issues such as microsampling, microdosing, what the PDCO would expect as a criteria for a good neonatal trial, the difficulties in defining this, because then the question was put back, and it is discussed, and it was discussed how difficult it is to find the ideal trial design, which also depends, of course, on the product itself. A voice was issued. Said that medical care should not be separated from medical research. So it should be more integrated. So if we care for neonates, the same criteria should be valid as we do for medical research, as one of the examples was that medical care itself might not be evidence-based, or we are trying to mitigate risk and try to avoid risk for a certain group, and thereby putting the whole group of all neonates at a risk by medical care which might not be evidence-based. One of the discussion points at first was also the issue that PDCO should cover the science bit and the ethics committees would take care of ethics. And it evolved that such a separation is quite difficult, and if not possible at all, just considering certain trial designs being necessary, and also taking into account, of course, ethical considerations. Therefore, on this part, an elaboration is needed, collaboration is needed, and that we will come to at a later point. Just to mark some conclusions also, because we had so wide-ranging discussions which often do not only, of course, apply to neonates, but as neonates are such a sensitive issue, such a vulnerable population. It was also discussed whether children in a society have a moral obligation to take part in a trial, to fulfill their role as a citizen. That was quite an interesting discussion, but it did boil down that, firstly, you can't separate science from ethics, and not doing science is in itself unethical. Not reporting and not delivering the products would also be unethical. So to find some concrete points of interaction, again, that is a little bit repetition of what other groups have worked on. The first point would be to have access to the PIP as such and to the summary report. And it was interesting to learn that it is expected from the PIP to deliver a complete scientific analysis. So on excipients, on preclinical toxicity, juvenile animal studies, in the clinical part, on an analysis of all data known. So to provide a basis for the ethics committee to take a decision. Of course, then within the discussion, it was also made clear that the level of detail it depends a little bit also on the timing, on the development of the product, whether it's a complete new product, whether it's just a plan, because PDCO often has to request juvenile animal studies and doesn't know any results as yet because it's a plan. When discussing about the interaction and what ethics committees could give back and feedback to PDCO, further few points were discussed and called for, specifically in a format to be decided, such as in a working group, to discuss the possibility of exploratory trials, emergency trials, not results, emergency trials, exchange of expertise, and the last points were emphasized several times, that a rediscussion is needed of ethical acceptability, particularly for the age group of neonates, as it was mentioned that this is the last bastion of perhaps overprotection, instead of really promoting ethics as using as a promotion of good science for public health, and not resulting in an overprotection, and that the management of the risk management and of the over valuing of risk as opposed to a possible benefit should be re-explored and rediscussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we did the four reports one after the other, because there certainly are some common themes already emerging. But before I say anything more, I'd like to hear from the floor. Yes?
I just want to make one comment on the presentation for the fourth group. It was a very well done presentation, but I just want to clarify one thing with respects to what happened in Canada. Health Canada isn't the author of any report. It was a study that was undertaken for a 5-year time period about standardizing research ethic boards in Canada, and it was conducted by the Conference Board of Canada, the Canadian Standards Association. And so the report was released in the summer of 2011. It should be made available now. Yeah, it wasn't the government of Canada, because everyone came together, industry, government, healthcare providers, okay?
Thanks for that clarification. And that report is now available. I'm sure in Europe it would be of interest as well to see if they succeeded or not. All right.
Could I comment on and just ask for clarification? Christoph's summary of the group that he was animating or acting as scribe for. I understand, involving children, clearly, one has to avoid tokenism. How do you identify a child or two who could represent all the children of Europe and all the specialties? Very difficult. One way of doing this more effectively might be to use the existing networks that do have children's advisor groups within them. And by my reckoning, there are 18 of such networks in Europe. Those that meet the Category 1 criteria of EMPRIMA. They all have such advisory groups of children. You can't, it's very threatening for a child to come to a group such as this, although some 13, 14-year-olds will tell us what to do. They're very confident. But I think there is a way around that problem, because otherwise you will get clinicians representing children's views, which is a little bit processed, second-hand or third-hand. Anyway, just wanted to feel, was that raised in your group?
Well, we didn't mention networks, which is a very important proposal. What was discussed was that patient organizations, which do exist for some diseases and more likely chronic diseases, sometimes are very good at voicing the needs and making decisions about what risks they would like to take to achieve a certain benefit. So these could be, but usually you would expect these patient groups also represent the advisory groups for networks. So I think there's an overlap. But we also discussed that for certain areas, like for example, trauma or acute diseases, you would not find patient representatives groups, and that's much more difficult to judge their views.
Could I just come back on patient groups? They will tend to be represented by parents. And there may even be a slight variation between parental views and child views. Even within chronic diseases, you will find some differences there.
Dr. Chambers?
Certainly in the PDCO, we are at a very early stage of developing this, but we have, at this early stage, identified the networks, and particularly the Scottish network, well, of course, as a rich potential source. I know there are many others, but and they have all been written to asking for help.
And yes.
I think we have to go even further than that and be maybe more creative. It's for the time being just ideas, but I think we should consider having panels of children and adolescents providing ideas on more general issues, not on a particular protocol, and that can be done with a network and their involvement, but sort of, would you accept intramuscular injection? Would you consider this? And I think there we could take care of the cultural differences and the language issues, and will not be, of course, like in a tribunal in front of the court, but it would be a sort of groups. But I think having these views would also be an educational tool for people to understand the benefit of research, because that's something we're struggling with. We are not in charge of teaching the member state how to deal with it, but there is a lack of understanding in the general population of the benefit of research. So maybe by involving young adults and young adolescents and children, we could little by little make them understand, and trying to work on this model could be in a time relaxed way rather than during the PIP procedure, which is a bit so working on this type of ideas could be interesting.
That's exactly what happens in the networks that I'm aware of. MCRN, for example, I'm sure they want to comment. That's exactly what is being done. There's an educational component, and these are advisors of young people who don't necessarily have the disease that you're talking about. So it's exactly that.
All right. If you're on that point, I'll defer to you first, and then we'll go over there. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just to say that the MCRN have a huge public engagement element to their work, especially, but driven by young people as well, because on our committees we've got young people from a mixture of backgrounds, so they've got clinical trial experience or health, they don't necessarily have to have been involved in a clinical trial, so they're teaching each other. So we're hoping to get clinical trials education onto the curriculum, put paediatric clinical trials, and we're working with hopefully the Nuffield Foundation next year to do that in the UK. So it's a big element of our work, because it's no point preaching to the converted all the time. We need to get to those children who don't know about clinical trials.
I totally agree. We need to have the same models in elsewhere, because we need also the multicultural approach.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
We also had a word of warning discussion that if you speak to patient groups in Europe as opposed to America, you may well get differing results in different countries. So just something to bear in mind as well.
We already have different results.
Good point. Other comments on the 4 reports? If there are no other comments, I noted what yes, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I have also a question. The neonatal group suggested a sharing of expertise, and I was also thinking, would it be of interest for members of ethics committee dealing with pediatric trial to have some, I don't know, some time at the PDCO to look at also the discussion that are taking place? Because that could be of interest. Maybe we could look at the issues of confidentiality and how it can be dealt with. But I think maybe that would be also of interest for people to understand what are the type of discussion, how the things are discussed.
I think that would be highly instructive and a really dynamic way of addressing some of these issues. Leaving aside some of the technical and more scientific elements coming from the specificity of the subject matter of the 4 reports, there are about 3, and the harmonization of interpretation of laws and so on, another very specific issue. I think from this session then this morning, and I think breaking out was a really good idea. We see the same themes coming back about accessibility and transparency in terms of exchange of information in more detail, but in more understandable detail, whether it's executive summaries or summary reports, reporting or exchange of expertise between PIPs and ethics committees and so on, and then allowing, in that sense, guidelines to develop through this shared expertise. I think that's really an important element in terms of both transparency but also accessibility. Another interesting leitmotif, or whatever you want to call it, that went through was in terms of more involvement, whether it's of children or clinicians or panels or models coming from different countries, as you mentioned, of either patients or in particular clinicians or children themselves. So I think that increased even more interdisciplinary than we are now already, but in terms of targeting certain populations whose voices might not be currently heard. And finally, the 2 groups, and as a matter of fact, brought up the issue of that the discussion in ethics should also include the discussion of the benefits of research and not be limited to harm reduction or risk management or identification of harms. And in that sense, the relationship between science, good ethics, and good medicine, that ultimately the goal of research is to translate into medicine, into products, availability of products, and so on for the public, and the ethical acceptability of research having to be, again, reminded, I think, of that as a theme that should permeate documents or such exchanges.